As Clara Hayes drew and pried open the heavy wooden box hidden in the dusty attic of the Sterling Manor, her hands trembled as she realized what lay before her eyes. Documents that proved years of systematic betrayal, papers that could utterly destroy a powerful man or save a good man from complete ruin. In that moment, with her 3 small children sleeping soundly in the carriage house, out back and only 30 days before they lost the only home they had ever known, she made a decision that would haunt her for months. She would use her own triplets, their innocence and natural charisma, as a weapon in an impossible battle against a ruthless businessman who had stolen everything from her employer. What she couldn't have imagined was the devastating emotional price she would pay. The sleepless nights spent working to the point of exhaustion, the moral sacrifices that would make her question who she truly was, and above all, how a mother's love could transform her into someone capable of crossing any line to protect her children. This is the story of a cook who dared to defy the powerful when she had nothing left but desperate courage, and how sometimes the greatest victories are born from the darkest moments of our lives. Discover how a simple woman achieved the impossible and changed not only her destiny, but that of everyone around her in a journey of suffering, redemption, and hope that will touch your heart until the last word. Tuesday morning arrived at the Sterling Manor in Greenwich, Connecticut, with the crushing weight of a life-altering announcement. Clara Hayes, 38, was in the sprawling kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the heavy, dragging footsteps of Harry Sterling, descending the grand staircase. Something in that sound was different, carrying a hesitation she had never noticed in the 12 years she had worked in the 3-story house. The smell of fresh-baked bread spread through the spacious kitchen, with its custom-imported stone countertops that reflected the golden morning light. But even that comforting aroma couldn't disguise the tension hanging in the air. Harry entered the kitchen, his face pale, deep circles marking his usually well-kept skin. His hands trembled slightly as he held a plain white envelope. Clara dried her hands on her embroidered apron, the one her daughter, Lilia 7, had decorated with colourful flower drawings, and felt her stomach clench with a terrible premonition. Harry did not look at her directly when he spoke, keeping his eyes fixed on the window overlooking the lawn, where Clara's triplets usually played every afternoon. His voice was low, barely a whisper, thick with shame and defeat. He had to sell the manor. The words fell on Clara like heavy stones, each syllable crushing a piece of the security she had built over more than a decade. The 3-story property, with its wide halls full of family photographs, its spacious bedrooms that had witnessed generations of the Sterlings, and especially the small carriage house out back where Clara was raising her 3 children alone, all of it would be sold. Harry explained that he needed to settle urgent debts, that things hadn't been right for a long time, that he had tried everything, but there was no way out. Clara remained silent, feeling her legs weaken as she leaned against the cold marble counter. That house was not just her workplace. It was the only true home that Liam, Lily and Theo had known since birth. It was where they learned to walk, where they shared their first belly laughs, where they built every important memory of their short lives. In the following days, the activity at the manor became frantic and painful. Real estate brokers arrived in impeccable suits and professional smiles, measuring rooms, taking photographs, making notes on gleaming tablets while discussing values that made Clara feel nauseous. Every visit was a stab to her heart. Every comment about necessary renovations or resale potential sounded like an imminent eviction notice. Harry moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding Clara's gaze, locking himself in his study for hours, and she could hear the muffled sound of tense phone conversations through the mahogany door. The routine that was once so predictable and comforting was now contaminated by constant anxiety. Clara continued preparing meals with the same care as always, but her stomach was permanently tight, and at night, Lying in the small carriage house with the triplets asleep in the next room, she lay awake, calculating how much time she had left before she had to leave without anywhere to go. The job market in Greenwich was not generous for a 38-year-old woman with 3 small children and no training beyond her practical culinary skills. The true agony began when Clara, while tidying Harry's study on a rainy Thursday afternoon, accidentally knocked over a stack of documents on the desk. As she hurriedly gathered them, her eyes caught fragments of information that made her stop and read more carefully. They were bank statements, contracts, correspondence from lawyers with technical language she barely understood, but certain words leaped from the paper with disturbing clarity: embezzlement, joint liability, foreclosure. And one name appeared repeatedly: Victor Thorne. Clara knew Victor. He had dined at the house many times, always effusively complimenting her dishes, always with that too wide smile and too firm handshake. He was Harry's partner in the bee manufacturing firm. A burly man with a deep voice who drove a foreign car and wore expensive watches that reflected the light with the slightest wrist movement. Something in the documents didn't make sense, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine when she realized that the dates of the most problematic transactions coincided with periods when Harry was traveling on business, absent from the city, while Victor had signed off alone on decisions that now placed all the financial responsibility squarely on her employer's shoulders. Clara replaced the papers exactly as they had been, her hands trembling so hard she had to take several deep breaths to calm herself. She wasn't sure exactly what this meant, but a dark suspicion began to germinate in her mind. Could Harry be being defrauded by his own partner? The idea seemed too absurd, like something out of a television drama, but the documents were there, cold and concrete, suggesting exactly that. During dinner that night, Clara watched Harry with renewed attention as she served the lamb stew he barely touched. The 42-year-old businessman looked like he had aged a decade in the last few weeks. His shoulders slumped beneath an invisible weight, his glazed eyes fixed on some distant point. He had visibly diminished, his once tailored clothes now hanging loose on his frame, and there was a fragility about him that Clara had never seen before. For the first time in 12 years of a strictly professional relationship, she felt something beyond respect or work obligation. She felt a genuine, painful compassion for the man who had always seemed so distant and untouchable in his position of power. The weeks dragged on in slow, methodical torture. More visits from potential buyers, more whispered conversations in the study, more nights when Clara saw the lights of Harry's office burning until the early hours of the morning. The triplets began to sense that something was wrong, especially Lily, who had an acute sensitivity to the emotions of the adults around her. The 7-year-old began drawing pictures for Harry, small pieces of childish art, featuring colourful houses and smiling suns that she left timidly on his study desk. Liam, always the most practical of the three, asked his mother directly if they would have to move, and Clara couldn't bring herself to completely lie. She only said that perhaps they might, that changes sometimes happen, while feeling her heart break at the fear she saw in the boy's dark eyes. Theo, the quietest, simply clung to her more, following her around the house during her daily tasks, as if fearing his mother might disappear if he took his eyes off her for a second. It was on a foggy Saturday morning, when Harry asked Clara to organize some things in the attic, that everything changed. The manor's attic was a vast but rarely used space, filled with antique furniture shrouded in dusty white sheets, cardboard boxes stacked with decades-old belongings, and the characteristic musty scent of a place long sealed away. Clara climbed the narrow staircase with a cleaning cloth and trash bags, determined to complete the task quickly, despite the tightness in her chest she felt whenever she thought about leaving the house. Among the boxes, she found one made of dark wood, unlike the others, with a rusty metal clasp, but unlocked. Inside, documents were meticulously organized in file folders, some dating back more than 5 years. As she flipped through them with growing surprise, Clara realized they belonged to Harry's manufacturing firm, Dati. They were records of transactions, copies of contracts, and handwritten notes in an elegant script she recognized as belonging to Harry's late wife, Eleanor, who had passed 3 years prior after a prolonged illness. Clara's hands trembled as she read the documents with increasing focus. It was all there, carefully preserved, as if Eleanor had known that one day this evidence would be needed. Unauthorized wire transfers that didn't match the company's official ledgers, contracts signed solely by Victor Thorne during strategic periods when Harry was absent, systematic diversion of resources dating back at least 5 years. Harry's wife had discovered her partner's betrayal and documented everything, likely planning to confront him at the right moment. But her illness had taken her before she could act. Clara sat on the dusty attic floor, surrounded by those explosive revelations, and felt a mixture of horror and euphoria. Horror at realizing the depth of the betrayal Harry was suffering unknowingly, and euphoria at understanding that here, in her hands, was the salvation not only of her employer, but also of herself and her children. But along with these emotions came something much heavier, the consciousness of an overwhelming responsibility. What should she do with this information? Harry was so emotionally shattered that he might not even have the strength to use these proofs, and Victor Thorne was a powerful man in Greenwich, with deep connections in the local business world, capable of crushing any attempt at direct confrontation. Clara descended from the attic with the wooden box hidden beneath an old blanket, her heart pounding so hard she feared someone might hear it. She hid the box in the closet of her small bedroom in the door carriage house, pushing it into the darkest corner behind her few clothes. All night long she lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the soft breathing of the triplets in the next room, her mind spinning in frenzied circles. Through the window she could see the lights of the main manor, and there was that lonely glow again coming from Harry's study, the man who couldn't sleep under the weight of problems he didn't even fully grasp. Clara thought about simply handing the box over to him, letting him make his own decisions, but something stopped her. She knew Harry well enough after 12 years to understand that he was past the point of being able to fight for himself. He was too shattered, too exhausted, too defeated. If she simply gave him the documents, he would likely tuck them away in a drawer and continue his path toward complete ruin, unable to muster the energy needed to confront the betrayal of someone he had trusted for so many years. The following Monday, Clara woke up with a ferocious determination she hadn't felt in years. As she prepared breakfast, her movements were precise and decisive, as if every gesture was part of a larger plan that was just beginning to take shape in her mind. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she knew she had to act. Those documents represented not only Harry's salvation, but also her own chance to protect her children and the only home they knew. Over the following weeks, Clara began observing everything with renewed attention. She listened to the phone conversations she could catch, the visitors arriving at the manor, Harry's shifting moods that swung between silent resignation and moments of poorly contained despair. She started asking discreet questions around town, talking to the firm's suppliers and other staff she knew by sight, trying to piece together a more complete picture of the situation. And the more she uncovered, the more her conviction solidified. Victor Thorne had systematically stolen from his partner over years, building his own fortune at the cost of Harry's ruin, and was now poised to walk away unscathed, while a good man lost everything. But Clara also recognized her limitations with brutal honesty. She was a cook with no formal education, a single mother with no financial resources, no social connections beyond the limited circle of other domestic workers. How could she, alone, face a man like Victor Thorne? How could she expose the truth in a way that truly mattered? The answer didn't come immediately, but when it did, it was accompanied by an emotional cost Clara could barely bring herself to contemplate. She would have to be strategic, patient, and above all, willing to make sacrifices that haunted her just to imagine. That evening, while she was preparing dinner, Lily entered the Pune carriage house's kitchen with another one of her drawings. This one showed 4 figures holding hands, 3 small, 1 large, all smiling under a bright blue sky. The girl explained in her soft voice that it was their family, happy forever in the beautiful house. Clara hugged her daughter tightly, feeling tears burn her eyes, and it was in that moment that the seed of an impossible plan truly began to germinate in her mind. A plan that would involve not only courage and determination, but also something far more painful: using the love and innocence of her own children as a weapon in a battle she wasn't even sure she could win. The following days brought a silent but profound transformation in Clara. Externally, she continued performing her duties with the same efficiency as always, preparing elaborate meals that Harry barely touched, keeping the manor immaculate despite the growing sense of futility. But internally, something had changed irreversibly. She began waking up an hour earlier every morning, even before the sun rose over East Greenwich. And in that time, stolen from her already scarce sleep, she sat at the small kitchen table in the carriage house and ran the numbers. She calculated her monthly earnings, her basic expenses for the triplets, and how much she could save if she cut absolutely everything non-essential. The figures were disheartening, almost cruel in their mathematical clarity. Even saving every possible cent, it would take years to accumulate any significant sum, and time was exactly what she didn't have. Visits from potential buyers continued. Some weeks brought 3 or 4 interested parties, and each one represented the imminent possibility that the sale would go through and her world would completely collapse. It was during one of those solitary pre-dawn hours that Clara made a decision that would make her question her own moral nature in the coming months. She needed money, much more than she could save from her salary, and she needed it fast. She opened the small jewelry box she kept at the back of her drawer, a modest collection of pieces she had inherited from her mother, representing virtually everything of material value she possessed. There was a silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant, simple but genuine gold earrings, a delicate bracelet her mother had worn at her own wedding. Each piece carried precious memories, moments from a past life when Clara still had family beyond the triplets, when the world seemed less hostile and unforgiving. She held the necklace up to the faint lamplight, watching the metal reflect tiny glimmers, and felt the weight of this choice tighten her chest. But then she thought of Liam, Lily, and Theo. Sleeping in the next room, she thought of the panic she had seen in Liam's eyes when he asked about moving, and she knew there was truly no choice at all. The next morning, on her day off, Clara drove to the downtown area of Greenwich and sold all the jewelry at a pawnshop located on a busy side street. The man behind the counter offered less than half the true value of the pieces, she knew that, but she didn't have the luxury of negotiating or seeking better offers. The money from the jewelry gave her a small reprieve, but Clara knew it wouldn't be enough. She needed more, much more, and that's when she began working late nights in a way she never imagined she was capable of. After putting the triplets to bed at 9 p.m., she didn't go to rest, as she usually did. Instead, she turned on the small oven in her kitchen and began baking cakes, artisanal pies, gourmet cookies and pastries, everything she knew how to prepare expertly after years working at the Sterling Manor. She worked in near absolute silence so as not to wake the children, her movements precise and mechanical, guided more by muscle memory than conscious thought, as her mind was always elsewhere, calculating, planning, worrying. At 3 or 4 in the morning, when she finally finished, she carefully stored everything in containers and collapsed into bed for 2 or 3 hours before having to wake up again to start her workday at the manor. On weekends, she took her creations to the local farmers' market downtown, setting up a modest stall between fruit vendors and local artisans. Initially, sales were slow, but the quality of her goods gradually began to attract regular customers. Every dollar earned was saved, with religious care, in an envelope hidden in the same place where she kept the box of attic documents. The physical price of this brutal routine quickly became evident. Clara developed deep, dark circles that no amount of makeup could completely disguise. Her hands began to tremble from exhaustion in the afternoons, and she visibly lost weight despite constantly working with food. Twice she nearly fainted while preparing lunch at the manor, having to lean on the counter and breathe deeply until the dizziness passed. The triplets noticed the change in their mother, of course. Lily asked why she looked so tired. Theo started having nightmares and woke up crying in the middle of the night calling for her, and Liam, always the most observant, directly questioned why she was working so much if she already had a job. Clara lied, saying everything was fine, that it was just a phase, but she saw the worry in her children's eyes, and that guilt added to the burden she already carried. Still, she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. With every passing week, the hidden envelope grew a little thicker, but it was still far, far from being enough for any concrete plan of salvation. Meanwhile, Harry's situation continued to deteriorate in ways that broke Clara's heart. The 42-year-old businessman now seemed a shadow of the man he had been, moving through the manor like a ghost, lost in his own tortured thoughts. He stopped shaving regularly. His clothes were chosen carelessly, and there was a defeat in his eyes that was painful to witness. One afternoon, Clara found him sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at a framed photograph of his late wife, Eleanor. Silent tears streamed down his face, and he didn't even notice her presence until Clara, moved by an impulse of compassion that transcended the professional boundaries of their relationship, brought him a cup of hot tea and sat down respectfully at an appropriate distance. Harry thanked her in a choked voice, and perhaps because he was in a moment of extreme vulnerability, began to speak. He recounted meeting Eleanor in college, the early years of the manufacturing firms when everything was possible and the future shone with promise, and how Victor Thorne had joined as a partner, recommended by mutual friends, seemingly the answer to expanding the business. He spoke of Eleanor's illness, the 2 terrible years watching her fade, and how after she passed, he simply couldn't maintain the same focus on work. It was in that vacuum of attention that Victor had acted, Clara realized with chilling clarity, but she remained silent, just listening, offering the quiet presence he clearly needed. In that conversation, something fundamental shifted between them. Harry, for the first time in 12 years, truly saw Clara not just as the efficient employee who kept his household running, but as a real person with her own burdens and battles. He asked about the triplets, how she managed to raise them alone, and about their father. Clara, surprised by the genuine attention, found herself telling her own story, something she rarely did. The triplets' father had vanished before they were even born. Discovering they would have 3 babies instead of 1, the prospect of responsibility had sent him running, never to be seen again. She had raised Liam, Lily, and Theo, completely alone, with no family support, depending entirely on her job at the Sterling Manor. Harry listened in silence, and when she finished, he said something that would be etched into Clara's memory. He said she was stronger than he could ever be, that he admired her ability to keep fighting even when everything seemed impossible. In that moment, sitting in the living room as the afternoon light cast long shadows through the wide windows, a genuine connection was born between them, built on shared suffering and mutual respect. A connection that would make everything that came next even more emotionally complicated. The triplets, especially Lily, began to notice and react to the constant presence of sadness permeating the manor. The 7-year-old, with her sharp sensitivity, intensified her efforts to cheer Harry up. She started waiting for him in the hall every morning with a new drawing, increasingly elaborate creations that showed happy houses, smiling families, bright suns, and vibrant rainbows. Harry, touched by the child's innocent persistence, began carefully filing every drawing in a folder in his study. Liam and Theo also participated in their own ways. Liam started telling jokes he heard at school, most of them making little sense, but delivered with such enthusiasm it was impossible not to smile. And Theo, the shyest, simply stayed close, his silent presence offering a type of comfort that needed no words. Clara watched these interactions with a mixture of tenderness and growing pain, because a terrible plan was forming in her mind, a plan that would depend precisely on this connection the children had established with Harry, and the guilt of even considering using her children this way consumed her like acid. 3 months had passed since Clara found the documents in the attic. 3 months of exhaustive work, insufficient sleep, painful savings, and she still didn't have enough resources to execute the plan taking shape in her mind. Then something happened that would change everything again. One Saturday morning at the Source farmer's market, while selling her cakes and pastries, Clara was approached by an elegant woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dawn Miller, the owner of a small chain of upscale coffee shops in a Fairfield county. Dawn had bought Clara's products over the past few weeks and was impressed by the quality. She made a proposal. She wanted Clara to regularly supply sweets and cakes to her 3 coffee shops. The volume would be significant, as would the payment, much more than Clara could earn selling at the market on Saturdays. It was an incredible opportunity, almost too good to be true, but it came with an immense problem. To meet the demand of 3 coffee shops, Clara would need to work even longer hours than she already did, and she was already at the absolute limit of her physical capacity. But when Dawn mentioned the monthly amount she would pay, Clara quickly did the math in her head and realized that with that additional money, her impossible plan began to seem marginally possible. She accepted Dawn's proposal right there, without fully considering the consequences, driven by desperation and the ferocious determination she had developed. In the following weeks, Clara's routine became something beyond brutal. It verged on the inhumane. She slept a maximum of 3 hours a night, sometimes less. Her hands developed calluses over calluses from constant work, and she began to have constant pain in her back and shoulders. There were mornings when she woke up crying from pure exhaustion, not even knowing why she was crying, her body simply reacting to the continuous abuse. The triplets grew increasingly worried, but Clara brushed them off with quick kisses and empty promises that everything would soon get better. The truth was, she didn't know if she would survive that pace, but she also knew she had no choice. Every dollar earned brought her closer to a goal she hadn't even fully defined, but which she felt with visceral clarity was her only chance for salvation. The envelope hidden in her room was now truly thick, but it still wasn't enough. It never seemed to be enough. And meanwhile, more potential buyers visited the manor. More conversations took place in Harry's study with lawyers and accountants, and the clock continued ticking relentlessly. It was during one of those nights of solitary work, when the clock struck 2 a.m. and Clara was decorating her 100th cupcake of the night, that she finally admitted to herself the full truth of her plan. It wouldn't be enough just to have money. She would need much more than that. She would need help, connections, people willing to believe her story and support her cause. And the only way to achieve that would be through her children. The idea made her physically nauseous, but she couldn't see any other way out. People wouldn't care about a desperate cook trying to save her job, but they might care about 3 innocent children about to lose the only home they had ever known. It was pure manipulation, she knew it. It was using her own children as pawns in a dangerous game she barely understood. But what else could she do? The alternative was to accept defeat, accept that Harry would lose everything to a traitor, that she and the triplets would be thrown onto the street without resources or hope. In that cold, solitary pre-dawn, her hands shaking from fatigue and her eyes burning from lack of sleep, Clara made the decision that would haunt her for the next few months. She would use Liam, Lily, and Theo. She would use their innocence, their charisma, the natural endearment they inspired in people. She would take them to the markets, the coffee shops, the local events, and let their stories and their presence touch the hearts of the people of Fairfield County, in a way she alone never could. The implementation of this plan began subtly in the following weeks. Clara started bringing the triplets more frequently to the Sil Farmers Market on Saturdays, not just letting them play nearby as before, but actively involving them in her work. Lily, with her natural eloquence, began talking to customers, telling stories about how she helped her mother decorate the cakes, about how special it was to make something with their own hands to make other people happy. The girl didn't know she was being used. She only thought she was helping her mother, and that genuine innocence made her words even more effective. Liam and Theo also participated, organizing products, handing out packages, always smiling and polite in a way that melted people's hearts. Gradually, Clara's stall at the market became known not only for the quality of the products, but for the charming presence of the three children. People started coming back not just for the food, but to see the triplets, to hear Lily tell her stories, to feel that genuine human warmth emanating from the small family. And Clara, watching all this happen, felt her heart break a little more each day, because she knew she was crossing a moral line she never imagined crossing. But she kept doing it anyway, because the love for her children and the desperation of her situation had become stronger than her scruples. Autumn arrived in Greenwich, bringing colder temperatures and mornings enveloped in dense fog that was slow to dissipate. 4 months had passed since Clara found the documents in the attic, 4 months of incessant work that had physically transformed her into someone almost unrecognizable. Her face was thinner, marked by lines of fatigue that hadn't existed before, and her eyes held an almost feverish intensity that sometimes startled even herself when she looked in the mirror. But the envelope hidden in her room now contained an amount that, while still insufficient for any grand plan, represented more money than she had ever possessed in her entire life. Still, Clara knew that money alone wouldn't solve anything. She needed something more, something money couldn't directly buy. She needed influence, connections, people willing to believe her story and support her impossible cause. And it was in this moment of calculated desperation that she began taking the next steps of her plan, steps that would lead her deeper and deeper into ambiguous moral territory from which there was no return. Clara started attending community events in the Fairfield County, always accompanied by the triplets, neighborhood block parties, charity bazaars organized by local churches, regional craft fairs, anywhere people gathered and where she could establish connections. She brought her cakes and pastries to donate or sell at symbolic prices, and always, the triplets were present. Lily, at 7 years old and surprisingly eloquent, had become especially effective at captivating adults. The girl had a natural way of telling stories that held people's attention. She spoke about the importance of helping one another, about how small acts of kindness could change entire lives. She had no idea that her words were carefully directed by Clara to plant specific seeds in people's minds, seeds about community, about protecting the vulnerable, about the importance of not letting good people suffer injustice. Liam contributed with his contagious enthusiasm and wide smiles, while Theo, always quieter, touched people's hearts precisely because of his shyness and the way he clung to his mother's or siblings' hands. Together, the three formed a picture of innocence and need that was impossible to ignore, and Clara hated herself a little more at every event for using her children this way. But she didn't stop. The strategy began to bear fruit in ways Clara hadn't fully anticipated. People in Fairfield County began to know the story of the dedicated cook, raising 3 children alone, working tirelessly to give them a decent life. Stories were shared, first in casual conversations, then in local social media groups, and gradually Clara's small family became a known and beloved presence in the community. It was through this growing network of connections that Clara met August "Augie" Farrell, a 68-year-old retired lawyer who still maintained a small office downtown where he handled pro bono cases for people without resources. Augie was a tall, thin man, with perpetually messy grey hair and thick-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. He had a reputation in Fairfield County for being incorruptible and passionate about justice, characteristics that made him respected, but not necessarily popular among the town's most influential circles. Clara met him at a charity bazaar where Lily had impressed everyone with a small, impromptu presentation about the importance of solidarity. Augie was enchanted by the girl's eloquence and approached Clara to compliment her. It was in that initial, seemingly casual conversation that Clara planted the first seeds of what would become her most important alliance. In subsequent meetings with Augie, which always took place in public and seemingly casual contexts, Clara gradually revealed fragments of her situation. She spoke about working at the Sterling Manor for 12 years, about how Harry was a good man going through terrible difficulties, about how unfair it was that honest people suffered while others prospered at their expense. She never directly mentioned the documents she had found, never gave specific details about Victor Thorne, but she left enough breadcrumbs for some Augie Farrell, with his sharp legal mind, to start asking his own questions. The lawyer was too astute not to realize there was more to the story than Clara was revealing, but he was also experienced enough to understand that some information needed to be offered at the right time. One afternoon, after Clara had attended an event in the town square where the triplets had once again stolen the scene with their captivating innocence, Augie pulled her aside and directly stated that if she needed legal help, he was available. He didn't charge people in difficult situations, he explained, and there was something about her story that bothered him, a sense that injustices were being committed and remaining hidden. Clara felt her heart race, realizing her plan was working, that she had planted the right seeds with the right person. But along with the euphoria came a wave of nausea, recognizing how much she had manipulated the situation, using Augie's genuine kindness and the innocence of her own children. Meanwhile, the situation at the Sterling Manor continued to deteriorate. A buyer had finally made a serious offer for the property, a developer from Huston, Boston, who wanted to turn the place into a boutique hotel. The offer was good, very good in fact, enough to cover Harry's debts and even leave him a small sum to start over somewhere smaller. Harry had 30 days to decide whether to accept. The news hit Clara like a punch to the gut. 30 days. Only 30 days before everything definitively collapsed. She desperately accelerated her plans, but now she was working against a relentlessly ticking clock. That night, after putting the triplets to bed, Clara finally did something she had been putting off for months. She retrieved the wooden box containing the documents Eleanor had saved and took it to Augie Farrell's small office on a downtown side street. The lawyer was still there, despite it being nearly 9 p.m., working under the yellowish light of an antique desk lamp. When Clara entered, he immediately sensed from her expression that something important was about to happen. She placed the box on his desk, and her voice, trembling only slightly, told the entire story. How she had found the documents in the attic, what they contained, her suspicions about Victor Thorne, and above all, her desperation to save not only Harry, but also herself and her children. Augie spent the next 3 hours meticulously examining every document in the box, making notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally whistling softly in disbelief as he uncovered the depth of the documented betrayal. When he finally finished, he took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes, then looked at Clara with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. What she had found was more than enough evidence of systematic fraud and embezzlement, he explained. Eleanor had documented everything with almost obsessive precision, likely knowing that one day the proof would be necessary. With these documents, Harry could not only clear his debts, but also sue Victor for all the damage caused. However, there was a significant problem. Victor Thorne was a man with deep connections in Fairfield County, including influential businessmen and even the local judiciary. A direct confrontation could be complicated and protracted, and by Augie's calculations, take months or even years to resolve completely in the courts. And Harry had only 30 days before he had to sell the manor. It was an impossible situation, a problem with no solution within the established time frame. Clara felt despair threatened to consume her completely, but then Augie said something that would change everything again. He mentioned that while the judicial system was slow, public opinion in a town the size of Greenwich, Fairfield County, was fast and relentless. If Victor's betrayal were publicly exposed properly, the social pressure could force him to act much faster than any lawsuit. Augie's suggestion planted a dangerous seed in Clara's mind. Public exposure meant involving more people. It meant making the story widely known. It meant using all the connections she had built over the last few months. And it inevitably meant exposing her children even more, using the sympathy they generated to create a narrative that would move the community to act. It was manipulation on a grander scale than anything she had done so far, and Clara spent that night awake, lying in her bed, listening to the triplets sleep in the next room, questioning if she could truly go through with it. But when the sun rose, bringing another day of the 30 remaining before the manor's sale, she had made her decision. She would do whatever was necessary, cross any moral line she needed to cross, because the alternative was unacceptable. In the following weeks, Clara intensified her presence at community events to almost frantic levels. She began telling more specific stories about the injustice that was happening, always careful not to mention names directly, but leaving enough clues for attentive people to start making the connections. She spoke about an honest businessman being destroyed by the betrayal of someone he trusted, about how entire families would be affected, about how important it was for the community to unite against injustices even when the powerful were involved. The triplets continued to be her most effective weapon, though they didn't know it. Lily, especially, had become almost a local minor celebrity, her eloquence and natural charisma causing adults to stop and listen to her speak about kindness and justice. The girl didn't fully understand why her mother took her to so many places, why she needed to tell so many stories, but she loved the attention and the fact that she was helping her mother in some way. Liam and Theo also played their parts perfectly in their genuine innocence, and together the three created an image of vulnerability and need that was impossible to ignore. Clara watched all this with a growing weight of guilt crushing her chest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Through Augie, who was now a full ally in her plan, Clara began contacting specific people in Fairfield County. Small local business owners who might identify with Harry's situation, members of commercial associations, even a few journalists from the small local paper. Augie presented the story in a way that sparked indignation, using the documents Eleanor had saved as irrefutable proof of the betrayal, and gradually a network of support began to form. It wasn't a large or particularly powerful network, but in a town the size of Greenwich, Fairfield County, where everyone knew everyone, it was enough to start creating pressure. Victor Thorne, however, was not a man to be caught off guard easily. He began to notice the rumors circulating about him, the conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the looks of suspicion that hadn't existed before. His first reaction was to try to identify the source of the rumors, and it didn't take long for Clara's name to surface in his discreet investigations. One afternoon, he showed up at the Sterling Manor unannounced, something he rarely did, and asked to speak with Harry privately. Clara, who was in the kitchen, overheard fragments of the conversation through the slightly ajar study door. Victor's voice was smooth, but laced with veiled threat. He mentioned ridiculous rumors circulating through the county, suggested that certain people should be more careful about what they said, insinuated that spreading lies could have serious legal consequences. Harry, confused and still in the dark about everything that was happening, tried to defend him, saying he knew nothing, but Victor didn't seem satisfied. When he finally left the manor, he passed by the kitchen and met Clara's gaze. There was a moment of mutual recognition there, a silent understanding that they were now adversaries in a very dangerous game. Victor smiled, but it was a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he said only one thing before leaving. She should be very careful who she tried to challenge, because ordinary people didn't always fully understand who they were fighting against. The veiled threat left Clara trembling, not from fear for herself, but from fear for the triplets. For the first time since starting her impossible plan, she truly confronted the possibility that she might be putting her children in real danger. Victor was a powerful man, with resources she couldn't begin to imagine, and she was just a cook with modest savings and a fragile network of community support. What was she thinking, challenging someone like that? That night, she came close to giving up completely, to taking the box of documents and hiding it again, to accepting that some battles simply couldn't be won. But then, Lily woke up crying from a nightmare and called for her, and when Clara took her in her arms and felt her daughter's small, warm body trembling against hers, all hesitation vanished. She wasn't doing this just for Harry or the manor. She was doing it for Liam, Lily, and Theo, so they would have a chance to grow up in a safe place, so they wouldn't be thrown into the cruel uncertainty of not having a home. And for that reason, she would keep fighting no matter how terrifying the adversary was, no matter how many moral lines she had to cross, no matter the personal price she had to pay. The following days brought a palpable tension that permeated every moment of Clara's life. Only 2 weeks remained before Harry had to give a definitive answer to the Titus Boston developer. 2 weeks before everything collapsed irreversibly. The pressure was overwhelming, manifesting physically in constant headaches that even the strongest painkillers couldn't completely relieve, in persistent nausea that made it difficult to eat, and in entirely sleepless nights where she lay awake calculating and recalculating her chances of success. Augie Farrell worked tirelessly, using his contacts to spread the story of Victor's betrayal in a calculated manner, always presenting enough evidence for people to take it seriously, but never enough for Victor to sue them for defamation. It was a delicate balance, a dangerous dance on the fine line between public exposure and legal liability. Meanwhile, Clara continued her brutal work routine, but now with an even more urgent purpose. She had developed a final, desperate and audacious plan that depended on gathering enough support from the local community to create a real alternative to selling the manor. The plan was simultaneously simple and impossible. Clara wanted to transform part of the Sterling Manor into a community culinary arts school, a project that would generate jobs and training opportunities for low-income residents in Fairfield County. To make this work, she would need local investors willing to support the project. She would need to convince Harry to accept the idea instead of simply selling to the Boston developer. And above all, she would need to publicly expose Victor's betrayal in a way that would force him to return the money he had embezzled, money that would be essential to keeping the manor and starting the project. It was a plan with so many moving parts and so many possible points of failure that any rational person would dismiss it as impossible fantasy. But Clara didn't have the luxury of being rational. She had only 12 days left and a determination forged in months of suffering and sacrifice. She began working on a formal presentation of the project, staying up all night after finishing her confectionery work to write proposals, making financial calculations with numbers she barely understood, creating projections of community impact that sounded convincing even when she herself doubted their viability. Augie helped refine the legal and financial aspects of the project, and together they identified potential investors in Fairfield County. These weren't wealthy people in the traditional sense, but small and medium-sized local business owners who could contribute modest amounts that, when combined, could make a difference. Clara's strategy was to appeal not only to these people's business sense, but also to their sense of community and justice. She organized a meeting in a community hall downtown to present the project, inviting all potential investors, some members of the local press, and crucially, representatives of the Fairfield County Business Council, of which Victor was a prominent member. It was a risky move, a public exposure that would force all cards to be shown, but Clara had already passed the point where she could retreat. The night before the meeting, she could barely function. Her hands shook so much that she dropped an entire tray of cupcakes onto the kitchen floor, and she had to lock herself in the bathroom for 10 minutes just to breathe and try to control the panic that threatened to consume her completely. But when the triplets sought her out, worried, she wiped her face, forced a smile, and carried on because there was no alternative. The meeting took place on a cloudy Thursday afternoon, 7 days before Harry's final deadline. The Saw Community Hall was surprisingly full. Over 40 people had shown up, curious about the cook who had been causing such a stir in the county in recent weeks. Clara arrived accompanied by Augie. And against her better judgment, but following the cruel logic of her plan, she brought the triplets with her. Liam, Lily, and Theo were dressed in their best clothes, still modest but clean and well-kept, and sat in the front row of chairs, watching everything with wide-eyed, childish curiosity. The presence of the 3 children created exactly the effect Clara had coldly calculated, adding a layer of emotional urgency to the situation that numbers and rational arguments alone could never achieve. When Clara stood up to give her presentation, her legs trembled so much she had to lean on the makeshift podium. Her voice was weak at first, but gradually gained strength as she spoke about the Culinary Arts School project, about how it could transform lives, about how Fairfield County had a rich culinary tradition that deserved to be preserved and taught. She spoke about opportunities for low-income youth, about job creation, about community and belonging. And then, in the middle of her presentation, Clara did something that would haunt her for months to come. She called Lily to join her at the podium. The 7-year-old climbed up with her natural confidence, smiling at the audience, and Clara asked her to talk about what she thought was important about helping other people. Lily, with her surprising eloquence, spoke about kindness, about how everyone deserved chances, about how happy she and her brothers were in the house where they lived, and how wonderful it would be if other children could also have a special place to learn new things. Every word that came out of the girl's mouth was genuine, born from her own childlike understanding of the world. But Clara knew she had carefully choreographed that moment, having prepared Lily over the last few weeks without the child realizing she was being manipulated. Observing the audience, Clara saw exactly what she expected to see: teary eyes, moved expressions, adults being touched by the pure innocence of a child talking about things the adults themselves had forgotten how to value. It was emotional manipulation in its rawest and most effective form, and Clara felt her soul shrink a little more, fully acknowledging what she was doing. But when Lily finished, and the audience applauded warmly, and when Clara saw several of the potential investors nodding in obvious approval, she knew it had worked. The second part of the meeting was even more tense. Augie Farrell stood up and, with the authority of his years of legal practice, began speaking about injustices that sometimes occurred in the business world. He did not mention Victor Thorne by name initially, but began describing a hypothetical case of one partner betraying another, systematically embezzling funds over years, leaving an honest man to shoulder all the debts while building a fortune in the shadows. The description was too specific to be dismissed as a mere hypothesis, and Clara watched Victor, who was sitting near the back of the hall, grow progressively paler and more tense. Augie then revealed that he had in his possession documents proving exactly this type of betrayal had happened in Fairfield County, involving a local manufacturing firm, and that he was prepared to make these documents public unless the situation was rectified. It was a moment of direct confrontation that made the air in the hall thick with tension. Victor abruptly stood up, his voice loud and full of manufactured indignation, declaring that this was defamation, that he would sue anyone spreading lies about him, that he had lawyers far superior to a retired man working pro bono. But Augie remained calm and simply said that the truth was not defamation and that he was more than willing to present the evidence in any court Victor chose. The confrontation could have dangerously escalated if not for the unexpected intervention of several people in the audience. Small business owners who had dealt with Victor over the years began to speak, some mentioning transactions that never made complete sense, others talking about rumors that had always circulated but were never confirmed. A man in his 50s, the owner of a smaller textile mill, stood up and declared that he had always suspected something was wrong with the way Victor conducted business, that he had lost an important contract years ago in a way that seemed strange at the time, but now began to make sense. It was as if Augie's presentation had finally given voice to suspicions that many people had harbored for years, but never dared to express publicly. Victor, realizing he was losing control of the situation, tried to leave the hall with dignity, but Augie called him back with an authority that brooked no refusal. He declared that Victor had a simple choice. He could wait for the documents to be made public and face the inevitable legal and social consequences, or he could do the right thing immediately, admit his betrayal, return the embezzled amounts to Harry, and leave Fairfield County with what remained of his reputation. The silence that followed was absolute, so dense that Clara could hear her own heart beating furiously in her ears. Victor did not respond immediately. His face had cycled through various shades of red during the confrontation, and now it was paper white. He looked around the hall, seeing the expressions of distrust and disapproval on the faces of people who had once treated him with respect. And Clara saw the exact moment he realized he had lost. Lost not necessarily in legal terms, as he certainly had the resources to fight in court for years, but lost in terms of social reputation in a community where reputation was everything. In a controlled voice, but trembling slightly with contained rage, Victor said he needed to consult his attorneys, that this wasn't over, but that he would consider the proposal. It wasn't an admission of guilt, nor was it even a real promise of restitution, but it was enough to plant the seed of possibility. The meeting ended in a buzz of animated conversations, with several of the potential investors approaching Clara to express interest in the culinary arts school project, others offering support in different ways. Clara thanked them mechanically, smiling and shaking hands, but inside she was completely numb, unable to fully process what had just happened. The triplets, who had remained quiet and confused for most of the meeting, now ran around the emptying hall, relieved that the boring part was over, completely oblivious to the crucial role they had played in that carefully orchestrated theater. That night, after putting the children to bed, Clara finally broke down. She sat on the floor of her small kitchen and cried in a way she hadn't cried in years. Deep sobs that shook her entire body and seemed to tear something essential out of her. She cried for the innocence she had stolen from her children by using them as tools of emotional manipulation. She cried for the person she had become over those months of desperate struggle. She cried for the crushing weight of responsibility she carried on her shoulders and could never share with anyone. When she finally managed to calm down, it was past midnight, and she needed to wake up in a few hours to start another day of work. But that night, for the first time in months, Clara didn't work on pastries or planning. She simply sat in the dark, looking out the window at the lights of the main manor where Harishas was likely also awake, still unaware of what had happened that afternoon, unaware that his cook had moved heaven and earth and compromised her own soul to try to save him. And Clara wondered if, at the end of all this, when the dust finally settled, she would be able to look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgust for the person she saw reflected there. The next morning brought news that spread through Fairfield County with the characteristic speed of small towns where everyone knows everyone. Victor Thorne had been seen leaving his home in the affluent neighborhood at 5 a.m. with several suitcases in his car, apparently driving out of town. Rumors instantly proliferated, fueled by the previous day's revelations that had already circulated widely. Some said he was fleeing before the authorities could act, others that he was just going to consult lawyers in larger cities. But the undeniable fact was that for the first time in years, Victor Thorne appeared to be retreating. Clara received the news through a call from Augie Farrell at 7 a.m., and while a part of her felt triumph, the dominant emotion was a fatigue so deep it seemed to penetrate her bones. She still had to go to work at the manor, still had to prepare breakfast for Harry, still had to maintain the appearance of normalcy while her inner world was in complete turmoil. When she arrived at the main manor kitchen, she found Harry already awake. Something rare in recent months, sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee in his hands and an expression of complete confusion on his face. Harry looked at Clara with eyes that seemed to truly see her for the first time in 12 years, not as the efficient employee who kept his house running, but as a real person with her own depth and complexity. He asked directly if she knew what was going on, as he had received 3 calls before the sun even rose, people talking about a community meeting, about accusations against Victor, about culinary school projects, and none of it made sense to him. Clara sat down at the table, something she had never done in all those years of work, and for the first time decided to tell the complete truth. She started with the day he announced the sale of the manor, described the desperation she had felt, the discovery of the documents in the attic that belonged to Eleanor, the weeks of exhaustive work saving every cent, the calculated use of the triplets to build community connections, the audacious culinary school plan, and finally the meeting the day before where everything had been publicly exposed. She spoke for almost an hour without interruption, her voice monotonous with pure exhaustion, while Harry listened in growing silence, his expression moving through shock, disbelief, anger, and finally something that seemed a complex mixture of gratitude and humiliation. When Clara finished, the silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Harry stood up and walked to the window, standing with his back to her for several minutes that seemed to stretch forever. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with conflicting emotions he struggled to process. He said he didn't know how to feel about all of it, that on one hand he was shocked and furious that she had made such monumental decisions about his life without consulting him, that he felt infantilized and diminished by having been saved by his own housekeeper, that the idea that Victor had betrayed him for years was a stab at still open wounds from the loss of Eleanor. But at the same time, and this was the part he seemed to have the most difficulty admitting, he was profoundly grateful because Clara had done what he lacked the strength or mental clarity to do alone. She had fought when he had simply given up. She had sacrificed herself in ways he could barely comprehend to protect not only him but also her own children. It was a gratitude poisoned by shame, and Harry visibly struggled to reconcile these opposing feelings. Clara remained seated, accepting his words without trying to defend or justify herself, because on some deep level she agreed with everything he said. She had crossed lines she shouldn't have crossed. She had made decisions that weren't hers to make, and while her intentions were to protect people she loved, the methods were questionable at best and morally reprehensible at worst. The following days brought developments that happened at dizzying speed. Victor Thorne, through his attorneys, contacted Augie Farrell, proposing a settlement. He formally denied all accusations of embezzlement, but was willing to make a significant payment to Harry as a resolution of partnership disputes and to close any possibility of future litigation. The amount offered was substantial, although certainly less than the total he had embezzled over the years, according to Eleanor's documents. But it was enough to wipe out all of Harry's debts and still leave a considerable reserve. In exchange, Harry would need to sign non-disclosure agreements, effectively agreeing never to speak publicly about the matter. It was a deal that would allow Victor Thorne to preserve some semblance of dignity while discreetly leaving Fairfield County, and it would give Harry the financial breathing room he desperately needed. Augie recommended accepting, explaining that fighting in court could take years and consume resources Harry didn't have, and in the end, they might not secure much more than what was being offered now. Harry took 2 days to decide, 2 days during which he moved through the manor like a tormented ghost, but he finally agreed because pragmatism won over wounded pride. With Victor's settlement secured, the second part of Clara's plan could finally materialize. The Community Culinary Arts School. Project gained surprisingly quick traction in the Fairfield County community. The potential investors who had appeared at the community meeting began to formally commit, some contributing money, others offering equipment or services, still others volunteering to teach or help with administrative aspects. It was as if the entire town had been touched by the story of the cook fighting to save not only her job but a good man from unjust ruin, and people wanted to be part of that narrative of community redemption. Within a week, there were enough resources committed to start the project viably, and Harry, still processing everything that had happened, agreed to cede the top 2 floors of the Sterling Manor to house the school, while he would live on the ground floor and work on rebuilding his life as a consultant in the manufacturing industry. The solution wasn't perfect. The manor would be irreversibly transformed, but it was infinitely better than selling it completely to be turned into a hotel. And crucially, it meant that Clara and the triplets could remain in the small carriage house, their home preserved against all impossible odds. The practical implementation of the project, however, revealed costs and sacrifices Clara hadn't fully anticipated. She would be the director of the Culinary Arts School, a position of enormous responsibility for someone without administrative training or managerial experience. She would have to learn everything on the job, make inevitable mistakes, and endure the constant scrutiny of people who had invested money and expected tangible returns. More than that, her relationship with Harry had changed irreversibly and uncertainly. He was no longer simply her boss, and she was no longer simply his employee, but what they were now was undefined and uncomfortable. There was gratitude on his part, but also resentment for the way he had been saved, for the exposure of his vulnerability, for the necessity of accepting help from someone who had always been in a subservient position. On Clara's part, there was satisfaction for having achieved the impossible, but also overwhelming guilt for the methods used, especially the use of the triplets as tools of emotional manipulation. Lily, Liam, and Theo started asking questions Clara didn't know how to answer. Why did so many people in town know them now? Why did people stop to compliment them on the streets? Why did their mother sometimes cry when she thought they weren't looking? The children sensed that something important had happened, but couldn't fully comprehend it, and Clara didn't have the courage to explain how she had used their innocence. 3 weeks after the community meeting, the Culinary Arts School began its renovations on the upper floors of the manor. Workers arrived every morning, the sound of hammers and power saws filling the space that was once silent and melancholy, and gradually the property began to transform. Walls were knocked down to create open classrooms. The old, spacious second-floor kitchen was modernized with industrial equipment donated by local suppliers, and bedrooms were converted into demonstration and culinary practice areas. Clara supervised everything while still fulfilling her obligations to cook for Harry and care for the triplets, a workload that should have been impossible, but which she carried with determination born from months of training in resisting the impossible. Harry watched the transformations with expressions that oscillated between melancholy for the loss of the house as he had known it and something that might have been hope for what it was becoming. One afternoon, he called Clara to the study, and for the first time since the full truth had been revealed, they talked not as boss and employee, not as savior and saved, but as two people trying to navigate a complex situation that neither of them had chosen, but which both needed to accept. Harry began by saying he had spent weeks trying to process everything that had happened, and that he had come to some difficult conclusions. He recognized that he had been so emotionally broken in recent months that he probably would have simply sold the manor, paid his debts, and disappeared somewhere smaller to live the rest of his life in defeated resignation. Clara had prevented that, and although her methods were questionable and the way he had been saved hurt his pride deeply, he was alive in a way he hadn't been for years. He had purpose again, people depending on him, a project to build, even if it wasn't the project he had envisioned for his life. He said he would never be able to look at Clara without feeling that strange mixture of gratitude and humiliation. But perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps humility was exactly what he needed to learn. Clara, in turn, admitted that she had no easy answers for the moral questions her plan raised. She had used her own children in ways that haunted her every night. She had manipulated the emotions of good people for her own ends. She had crossed lines she didn't know if she could step back from. But looking at the triplets playing in the garden through the study window, seeing them happy and safe in the only home they knew, she couldn't completely regret it, even if she wanted to. Sometimes, she suggested in a tired voice, the right and wrong choices weren't as clear as they wished they were, and all they could do was live with the consequences and try to be better moving forward. 8 months had passed since that community meeting that changed everything. Spring had arrived in Fairfield County, bringing flowers to the gardens of A.T., the Sterling Manor, now officially renamed the Eleanor Sterling Culinary Arts Center, in honor of Harry's late wife, whose persistence in documenting Victor's betrayal had made everything possible. The top 2 floors of the property had been completely transformed. No longer private family rooms, but vibrant spaces filled with students learning culinary techniques, aromatic with the smells of pastries baking and sauces simmering, alive in a way the manor hadn't been for years. Clara now moved through the halls with a badge identifying her as director, a position that still made her feel like an imposter on many days, but which she was gradually learning to occupy with competence born of necessity and determination. The first months had been chaotic, full of administrative errors, minor financial crises, and moments where she seriously questioned if she could make it work. But slowly, painfully, the school began to find its rhythm and establish its reputation in Fairfield County and neighboring towns. The triplets, now 8 years old, had adapted to the changes with the characteristic flexibility of children, though not without their own challenges. Lily had developed a growing awareness that something important had happened months ago. something where she and her brothers had played roles they didn't fully comprehend. The girl asked increasingly specific questions that Clara struggled to answer honestly without destroying the innocence that remained. Liam had become quieter and more observant, losing some of the effusive enthusiasm that had always characterized him, as if he had realized the adult world was more complicated and darker than he had imagined. Theo, always the most sensitive, had developed an almost anxious attachment to his mother, fearing to let her out of sight for too long, as if she might disappear if he wasn't vigilant. Clara saw these changes in her children and felt the crushing weight of guilt in her chest, knowing she had been responsible for stealing something precious from them, an innocence and lightness they could never fully recover. She tried to compensate by spending more time with them now that her financial situation was more stable, taking them on weekend outings, reading bedtime stories even when exhausted. But she knew that no amount of present attention could fully undo what she had done in the past. Harry D. had also changed in visible and invisible ways. Physically, he had regained weight and a healthier appearance. The pale, defeated ghost of months past was replaced by a man who, though still carrying sadness in his eyes, had restored purpose and dignity. He worked as a consultant for small and medium-sized marquee manufacturing firms in the region, using decades of experience to help others avoid the mistakes and pitfalls that had almost destroyed him. The job didn't have the prestige of running his own company, but it had meaning, and Harry found genuine satisfaction in using his knowledge to help others. His relationship with Clara remained complex and undefined. They saw each other daily, as both lived and worked on the same property, and they developed a dynamic that was no longer boss and employee, but wasn't exactly friendship in the traditional sense either. It was something deeper and more complicated, built on shared vulnerability, mutual sacrifices, and the recognition that they were fundamentally linked by events neither of them could undo. They talked about the school's challenges, about decisions that needed to be made, about small victories and daily frustrations, and in these conversations there was an honesty and authenticity that transcended the old class barriers that once completely separated them. The triplets developed a peculiar relationship with Harry over those months. He wasn't family exactly, but he wasn't a stranger either. He occupied a unique space in their lives that was hard to define. Harry, who had never had children of his own, found that he appreciated the children's presence in ways he hadn't anticipated. Lily still brought him drawings occasionally, now more sophisticated, reflecting her artistic growth, and he carefully saved them all as he had done from the beginning. Liam started asking questions about business and how things worked, showing a natural curiosity that Harry patiently nurtured, happy to have someone interested in his knowledge. Theo simply liked to sit near him in the afternoons, doing homework in the same room where Harry worked on his consulting reports, a quiet presence they both found comforting. Clara watched these interactions with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was touching to see genuine connections forming, but on the other, she couldn't forget that those connections had been originally built on calculated manipulation, and that contaminated origin haunted her constantly. 6 months after the official opening of the Culinary Arts School, something unexpected happened that would force everyone to confront unspoken truths they had been avoiding. Lily, demonstrating the sharp perceptiveness that had always characterized her, confronted her mother directly one night after Liam and Theo were asleep. The 8-year-old asked why Clara had used them, why she had taken them to so many places and made them talk to so many people months ago, why she felt her mother was always sad, even when she pretended to be happy. The questions were asked with a clarity and maturity that shouldn't exist in someone so young, and Clara realized she could no longer run from that conversation. She sat down with Lily at the small kitchen table and for the first time told the complete truth, adapted for a child's understanding. She explained about the possibility of losing their home, about discovering that Harry was being defrauded, about having no resources or power to do anything alone, and finally about how she had used Lily and her brother's natural goodness and charisma to touch the hearts of people who could help. She admitted that it had been wrong to use children that way, that she regretted it even though it had worked, that Lily had every right to be angry with her. The girl listened in silence, processing information that reframed memories of the last few months. And when she finally spoke, she said something that completely surprised Clara. Lily said she wasn't angry. She was confused and a little sad because she realized that adults sometimes did bad things for the right reasons. And that was more complicated than the stories they read in books, where villains were clearly evil and heroes clearly good. She asked if Clara would do the same thing again, if she could go back in time. And Clara, after a long pause, answered honestly that she didn't know, that she wished she could believe she would find another way, but that in the desperation of that moment, she couldn't see any alternatives. Lily then asked the question that would define everything that came next. If she used them but saved their family and Harry too, did that make what she did right or wrong? Clara had no answer for that, and admitting it to an 8-year-old was one of the hardest things she had ever done. She said that some questions didn't have simple answers, that adults often made choices in grey areas where right and wrong blurred, and that all they could do was recognize when they erred, learn, and try to be better. Lily accepted this with a seriousness that broke Clara's heart and hugged her mother, saying she still loved her even when she didn't completely understand everything she had done. In that embrace, Clara felt something begin to heal inside her. Not completely, never completely, but enough to breathe a little easier. The conversation with Lily led to similar conversations with Haisham and Theo. In the following days, each adapted to the individual personality and understanding of each child. Liam reacted with surprising pragmatism, saying that if it worked and they still had a home, then it was okay, although Clara suspected he was simplifying his true feelings to protect her. Theo cried, not because he was angry, but because he hated thinking about his mother suffering and doing things that made her sad, and Clara held him until the tears stopped. After these conversations, something subtly shifted in the family dynamic. The triplets seemed older in an indefinable way. They had crossed some invisible threshold of understanding about adult complexity, but they also seemed relieved that unspoken secrets had finally been exposed. And Clara, although she still carried guilt that would likely never completely disappear, felt she could finally begin to process everything that had happened without being constantly crushed by the weight of lies and omissions. Summer arrived, bringing intense heat and the first full graduating class of the Culinary Arts School. 23 people, mostly young adults from low-income families in a Fairfield County and surrounding towns, completed the intensive 6-month program and were ready to enter the job market with genuine skills and recognized certifications. The graduation ceremony was held in the Manor Garden on a sunny afternoon, with families of the graduates, project investors, community members, and local press present. Clara, wearing her only formal dress that she had bought specifically for the occasion, gave a short speech about opportunity and how everyone deserved chances to build better lives through hard work and education. Her voice trembled at times, emotional over the materialization of something that months ago seemed like impossible fantasy, but she managed to finish to warm applause. Harry Tudd also spoke, officially dedicating the centre to the memory of his wife, Eleanor, and thanking the Fairfield County community for making the project possible. He didn't mention Clara specifically in his speech, but when his eyes met hers across the crowd, there was silent recognition and gratitude that needed no words. After the ceremony, when most of the guests had left and the sun began to set, casting golden light over the garden, Harry found Clara sitting alone on a bench near the small carriage house, where she and the triplets lived. He sat down beside her without asking permission, a familiarity that would have been unthinkable a year ago, and they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, just watching Lily, Liam and Theo playing with other children who had come for the graduation. Finally, Harry spoke, his voice low but clear. He said he had spent the last year trying to understand what had happened, trying to catalogue his feelings about being saved in such a humiliating way, about discovering betrayal from someone he considered a friend, about seeing his life completely reshaped by decisions made by someone else. And he had come to the conclusion that gratitude and humiliation could coexist, that he could be eternally grateful to Clara while also lamenting the circumstances that made her sacrifice necessary. More than that, he recognized that she too had paid immense prices, not only in physical labor and exhaustion, but in moral compromises that tormented her, and that in the end, both of them had lost and gained things that couldn't be easily quantified. Clara listened in silence, then replied with the honesty she had learned to offer more freely. She said she would never know for sure if she made the right choices, that she would probably carry guilt about using the triplets until the day she died, but that looking at those 23 people who had just graduated, seeing real opportunities being created, knowing that Harry was alive and rebuilt instead of lost in defeat, she couldn't completely regret it, even if she wanted to. Sometimes, she suggested in a tired voice, redemption didn't come from making perfect choices, but from making imperfect choices with honest intentions and then living with the consequences without running from them. Harry agreed silently and added something that surprised both of them with its contained vulnerability. He said that over the last year, watching Clara work tirelessly to make the school function, seeing her dedication to the triplets despite constant exhaustion, witnessing her courage in confronting the moral consequences of her actions, he had developed something beyond gratitude. He had developed deep respect, genuine admiration, and perhaps something more he wasn't yet ready to name, but recognized was silently growing. He wasn't suggesting anything, he quickly clarified, just acknowledging truths they had been avoiding admitting to themselves. Clara felt her heart accelerate at those words, not because she hadn't noticed subtle changes in the way Harry looked at her in recent weeks, but because hearing them spoken aloud made everything real and complicated in new ways. She responded carefully, saying she understood what he was saying because she felt similar currents within herself, but that they both needed to be honest about the enormous complications. They were not equals in any traditional sense. They came from completely different worlds, and although recent events had shuffled those barriers, they hadn't disappeared completely. More than that, any relationship between them would forever be contaminated by its origin in manipulation and desperate necessity, built on questionable foundations that would always make them doubt the authenticity of their feelings. Unadi, Harry acknowledged all those points as valid, but argued softly that perhaps real life was always more complicated than clean, perfect stories, that genuine connections could be born from imperfect circumstances, and that denying what was growing between them because of how it started would be letting the past permanently define their future. He didn't have answers on how to navigate those complications, he admitted. He just knew that for the first time in years he felt truly alive, and much of that was due to her presence in his life in ways that transcended the old roles of boss and employee. They sat on that bench as the sun finished setting, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, not reaching definitive conclusions about what that conversation meant for them, but also not denying the truths they had finally expressed. The triplets eventually ran up to them, tired from playing and ready to go home, and Lily Fu looked between her mother and Harry with that sharp perceptiveness she possessed, then smiled in a way that suggested she understood more than she should. Clara stood up, took Theo's and Dashka's hand as he reached out sleepily for her, and told Harry they should continue that conversation another day when both of them had more clarity. He agreed, standing up too, and there was a moment where it seemed he might reach out to her, touch her arm, or perhaps something more. But in the end, he simply nodded goodnight and walked back toward the main manor. Clara watched him go, then led the triplets into the small carriage house, her heart full of frightening possibilities and fragile hopes she didn't dare examine too closely yet. The following months brought a new and surprisingly sustainable routine. The Biel Culinary Arts School prospered beyond initial expectations, with a waiting list for future classes and local businesses specifically requesting graduates from the program. Clara grew into her role as director, still making mistakes, but learning quickly, gaining confidence in leadership abilities she never knew she possessed. The triplets flourished, adapting to life on a property that was now simultaneously home and educational center, making friends among the children of instructors and staff, developing their own identity separate from the dramatic events that had defined them for so long. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, Clara and Harry developed something that could only be described as a genuine partnership. Not romantically, at least not yet. Both were too cautious and too haunted by a complicated past to cross that line lightly. But there was deep mutual respect, hard-earned trust, and growing affection that suggested that perhaps, with enough time and continuous honesty, something more could develop when both were truly ready. A year after that community meeting that changed everything, Clara was in the manor garden watching the second graduating class receive their certificates. Lily, now 9 years old, stood beside her and surprised her mother by taking her hand and squeezing gently. The girl looked up at her and said something simple but profound, that she was proud to have a mother who fought so hard for them, even when the choices were difficult and scary, even when there were no clear right answers, even when it cost pieces of her own soul. Clara felt tears burn her eyes, not from sadness, but from something more complex, a mixture of gratitude for the unasked forgiveness and recognition that maybe, just maybe, she had done enough to justify the sacrifices. Harry, across the garden talking with investors, met her gaze in that moment, and the small smile they exchanged contained a shared acknowledgement of everything they had traversed and survived together. They were not perfect endings, none of them. Their lives remained complicated in 1,000 different ways, and the scars of everything that had happened would never completely disappear. But they were honest endings, earned through genuine suffering and impossible choices. And in that specific moment, standing in that garden under the summer sun, with children laughing around them and futures being built brick by brick, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was imperfect, but real redemption, proving that even from the most questionable manipulations and the deepest desperation, genuine transformation was possible when people found the courage to confront their own flaws, accept help from unexpected places, and choose to keep fighting even when every reason suggested giving up. And in that final recognition, both Clara and Harry finally allowed themselves to believe they deserved the lives they had managed to build from the ruins, together but separate, eternally connected by events that neither of them could undo, but that both learned to carry with growing dignity and renewed hope for tomorrow.